Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, James Cable, and I'm joined again with David Kirkpatrick. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good, and we got a special guest with us today, Mr. James Prichard. He is full of history, as we've already discussed before getting on here, that he has a historic background here, deep into Kentucky history. He was an independent scholar, or he is an independent scholar that lives in Louisville, Kentucky, but he was a supervisor at the research room at the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives. He worked at the Filson Historical Society for about 10 years, and he is the author of the Battled Capital, Frankfurt, Kentucky, in the Civil War. Mr. Prichard, thank you for joining us. How you doing?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Doing fine. Thanks.
Well, before we get too much into the history that you brought here for us to talk about, tell us a little bit about your Kentucky connection and just that background of yours.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm a native of Dayton, Ohio, but like a lot of families who moved to that city after the Second World War, why we were part of the sort of the Appalachian outmigration. So my father worked in the General Motors plant there. He continued to go back to Carter County in the northeastern part of the state where he was born. And that's where he met and married my mother and brought her back to Ohio. But I spent virtually every childhood summer in Carter County, Kentucky, and in the Ashland area. I was fascinated by the stories my grandparents and all the family elders told about local and family history, and that the marriage of that, along with the Civil War centennial in 1961 through 1965, yeah, jump started my interest in Kentucky history.
Well, that's pretty good. Like a lot of people, and you brought this up, and probably not mentioned this a lot, but I have relatives who they also went to Dayton. Some of them stayed, some of them came back, but it's a very typical, like I said, outward migration that took place in Kentucky's history there. Um, well, let's start off. We got some Kentucky history about the Civil War. You've written this book about the battled capital, and Kentucky has a lot of unique Civil War uh, pieces, I guess, of information or just events. But Frankfurt, that's a pretty interesting topic, I would have to say, during the Civil War. Um, Go ahead.
Yeah, I worked on the book for about 6 years, and I think I read every issue of Frankfurt's Civil War era newspapers. And of course, today is not too different in terms of the media as it was in that era, because uh, one newspaper, the Commonwealth, that was edited by Albert G. Hodges, was originally an organ for Henry Clay and the Whig Party, and would become union a pro-union newspaper. And then at the same time, the Frankfurt Yeoman, which was edited by Samuel Major, was a Democratic newspaper that would morph into a Southern rights newspaper. And so again, people were getting their news from, with a very specific message, party line wise, and then also over the controversies that would eventually lead to the outbreak of the Civil War. The interesting things about Frankfurt, one is that it was such a small city, and there was, I think, in 1860 the population was not much over 3,000. And
Oh,
at the same time, Louisville had nearly 70,000 residents. Um, Columbus, Ohio, the capital of that state, had approximately 18,000. Nashville, Tennessee, 17,000. So it was a really small community, but it endured a lot of wartime conditions that were shared, elsewhere in the nation, and it has the unique distinction of being the only loyal state capital that was occupied by Confederate forces in the fall of 1862. And of course, they installed a quote Confederate governor at that time in front of the old Capitol. And it was also the only loyal capital that was attacked uh, by Confederate troops. And then, of course, elements of John Hunt Morgan's command in June of 1864. And Governor Thomas Bramlett actually was in Fort Boone, of course, known today as Fort Hill, but in Fort Boone with a rifle and was engaged in fighting off the attackers, as was also John Marshall Harlan, the future Chief Justice.
Mm.
So again, there's some really distinct episodes that stand out as far as Frankfurt's role in the conflict.
and I've noticed in your book you talk some about even the arguments they had over who actually raised the flag, because from a strategic point of view, it wasn't actually that valuable, I guess, in a sense, but from a propaganda point of view, to take over a Union capital was a big deal.
Oh yeah, yeah. And again, there are conflicting accounts as to who lowered the United States flag over the old Capitol, of course, which was the Capitol, active Capitol building at that time, and raised the Confederate colors. And some accounts say it was a member of the Buckner Guides, which is a company of Kentucky cavalry that raised the flag. Others say it was an officer in the 1st Louisiana Cavalry, which was the first major Confederate unit to occupy the Capitol. But that was a very significant symbolic act at that time. And of course, you could sort of refer to that as the high water mark of the Civil War in the Western Theater in many ways.
It's so interesting because Kentucky is kind of this battleground of the Civil War, and again, the Western theater doesn't get nearly as much publicity, if you want to say it that way, as the Eastern theater, and understandably so. But that is the uniqueness of Kentucky during the Civil War. So many of these things happened that you kind of just it's the only place that it happened at, and it was in a way partially turning points as well. Um, you talk about the publicity of hey, we just took the capital. That's a big moment, but I also think of like that the southern states just having to say, hey, we've done something now, and this was one of those things. Um,
Yeah, the Capitol was occupied on September 3rd, 1862, after the disastrous Union defeat at Richmond, Kentucky. And again, by Colonel John Scott's cavalry brigade. He commanded the 1st Louisiana Cavalry, and his regiment occupied the Capitol briefly. And then after that, an infantry brigade occupied the Capitol, some Florida regiments primarily. And so there were actually gun emplacements in the historic cemetery. Confederate artillery batteries were placed along that ridge, overlooking the little valley that the town lies in. And on October the 4th, less than a month after occupation, there was a very big inaugural ceremony. And at that time, why many Confederate dignitaries, generals, attended. Richard Hawes of Bourbon County was inaugurated as the Confederate governor, and he held sway over the government of Kentucky for probably as long as 4 or 5 hours. Because if that, because at the time he was being sworn in, Don Carlos Buell, the Union commander in Kentucky at that time, was advancing, and he sent an entire Federal division out of Louisville, while other divisions were coming out of the same city but going toward, Perryville and other areas. And cavalry clashed with the division coming from Louisville through Shelbyville and on to Frankfurt. And so the sounds of the artillery in the distance could plainly be heard as the governor was taking his oath and giving his speech to the people of Kentucky. And there's a wonderful story. Brigadier General Humphrey Marshall was a prominent Kentucky Confederate. He commanded a small force Confederate brigade that was taking part in the invasion at that time, and he witnessed the inaugural ceremonies, and was standing beside Orlando Brown, who was a Union man, and but they were good friends in spite of their wartime differences. And when the artillery began to boom in the distance, Marshall looked over at him in disgust and said, "Well, that is our invitation to leave." And he said, "This has been nothing but a damn farce." And so he just stopped off. And the evacuation of the Capitol began shortly thereafter. And so for a brief moment, there was a Confederate governor in Kentucky, but of course he would spend the rest of his term in exile in Richmond, Virginia.
Mhm. Wow.
How much credit do you give to Buell for that? Because it's really a feint. He sends this division towards Frankfurt. Is that just a masterstroke on his part, or were the Confederates undermanned and undersupplied from the beginning?
I would have to give way to some real, serious scholars of the Battle of Perryville and the Perryville campaign. There have been a number of wonderful books written over the years, but the fact remains that Buell's approach to Perryville did confuse the Confederate high command, and they were convinced on October 4th, the day of the inauguration, that the battle for Kentucky would be fought near Frankfurt. And so they were primarily focused in that area. And so Kirby Smith, who commanded a large force that had advanced into Kentucky from East Tennessee, did not link up with Braxton Bragg and his army of Tennessee that had come up through Middle Tennessee and Middle Kentucky before finally on this particular day ending up in the vicinity of Perryville. But I couldn't comment on Don Carlos Buell's ranking as far as like top Union generals, but his feint did work, and it did cause some distraction. Bragg was convinced again that the battle for Kentucky would be fought somewhere along the Kentucky River near Frankfurt.
Mhm. And again, this all happened very quickly, like you said earlier. You have the Battle of Richmond, then Lexington pretty much is taken really quickly, and then they march on to Frankfurt.
Yes.
What time frame wise? Like I know that Frankfurt wasn't taken long, but from Richmond to this, how long? How long do you say?
It was just a matter of a day or two. See, the Battle of Richmond, if I remember correctly, was fought on August 30th, 1862, and the Union force there was just destroyed.
Mhm.
And so Kirby Smith's advance elements, Colonel John S. Scott's cavalry brigade, was in the streets of Frankfurt on September the 3rd. So it was very shortly thereafter.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny how fast those things go, but like I don't know, this is a tidbit, and this isn't Frankfurt, but Lexington was the only racetrack that has been flown or has a flag flown over it that was a different country. That within horse racing does not stop in Lexington no matter what, Civil War or not. um, but it all happened so quickly. That's kind of it's kind of wild to think how fast.
Union and Confederate soldiers greatly admired Kentucky horses, and they took them every chance that they got. So,
Yeah.
something else that's kind of colorful about the occupation of Frankfurt after the Confederates abandoned the capital, and the Union forces were approaching, on about October the 7th, October the 8th and thereabouts, um, Scott's cavalry returned and reoccupied the capital. And so a ragtag group of local Union soldiers and civilians got a beer barrel, and they mounted it on wheels, wagon wheels, and they posted it in the vicinity, if I remember correctly, of Berry Hill, so that it was facing the arsenal. And so when Colonel Scott went to the top of the arsenal with his binoculars, well, he thought that he was actually facing a section of artillery, and it delayed, it delayed his occupation of the capital for some time. And then later, at midnight or so, on October 8th, of course, the day of Perryville, early morning of October 9th, a severe clash, probably the most severe fighting in Frankfurt during this Civil War took place. And essentially, a Union cavalry brigade came into Frankfurt from the west, sort of down Berry Hill and Lafayette Drive, that particular section of South Frankfurt, and clashed with Colonel John Scott's brigade at the old bridge across the Kentucky River. And it was a very sharp fight. And the Confederates were driven off. And that has never made it into the history books.
Huh.
So you have a brigade level cavalry action, night action, taking place in the Capitol. And until the book was published, why it had never been referenced before. So that was a real discovery for me. I was completely surprised about that.
Yeah, wow. How much like for if you've not been to Frankfurt, Frankfurt is a very well or uniquely situated town, I guess to say that. It's right on the river there. How much of the geography, I guess, mattered or played an effect here with all the
Well,
um,
I think that
quickness?
the terrain may have been helpful in the defense of the capital in 1864. And of course, everything else involving the immediate vicinity of the capital took on military importance. So the Kentucky River became a route, of supplies
Mhm.
and contact with the city of Louisville and Cincinnati. And then, of course, the railroads that connected Louisville and Frankfurt and Lexington also became very important. And during the winter of 1864, 1865, Frankfurt was almost like an isolated island for several weeks because guerrilla presence was so strong. And so many Union regiments had been transferred out of state to the front that, the trains were stopped on the route between Louisville and Frankfurt, and beyond the city limits. The likes of Sue Mundy and Quantrell and One Armed Barry and other noted colorful guerrillas were prowling through the region, killing Union civilians and stealing their horses, plundering their homes. And then, of course, he's forgotten today, but Lieutenant Colonel George M. Jesse of Henry County uh, commanded a battalion-sized force that was based along the Kentucky River in Owen and Henry County. And he threatened the capital and the rail lines from June of 1864 until he surrendered in Henry County in May of 1865. And so I've often referred to the Golden Triangle between Covington, Frankfurt, and Louisville as Jesse's Confederacy, sort of a reflection of Mosby's Confederacy in the
Mhm.
Shenandoah Valley, because Jesse, he could never be run to earth. And so he was constantly active throughout that area. And, the telegraph lines would be cut to the capital, rail lines would be suspended, as I shared with you.
Wow.
So that all became part and parcel of the local military scene.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
something I'd wondered about because in your book you talk about the Frankfurt's union to the core, and I was wondering how far outside of Frankfurt that existed. Because you might be able to correct me on this. I think I read somewhere that the people of Bald Knob, probably 15 of them, voted to secede. And if you've
Yeah,
ever looked at Frankfurt, it's 10 minutes outside of Frankfurt. But the
you know,
capital itself, staunchly union.
when when Lincoln, after Lincoln's election and before the guns were at Fort Sumter, Kentucky was like a crazy woman's quilt. So you have a county like Franklin, which seemed largely pro-union, but immediately to the north, you have a county, Owen, that was overwhelmingly pro-Southern and pro-Confederate. It had been a strong Democratic county before the war and was known to Kentucky Democrats in the antebellum era as Sweet Owen because they always carried that county, and of course it would become a haven for Confederate activity for the rest of the war. But even when you look in Franklin County, as David just referred to, in the election of 1860, John Bell, the moderate Unionist candidate, head of the Constitutional Union Party, which was composed of former Henry Clay Whigs largely, he won the Frankfurt precinct. But John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Rights Democrat, carried rural Franklin County and overwhelmingly in Bald Knob. So yeah, you would have patches, of different political views in virtually every county in the state.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that is kind of interesting how quickly it would change from going from one place to the next. Any other counties like Henry County, like some others, or was Owen County the
Oh,
one that
there's
stood out the most?
another great example is in northeastern Kentucky, Morgan County. Of course, West Liberty is the county seat today, and during the war years, it included the southern half of present-day Elliott County. Um, was staunchly pro-Confederate, and Morgan County, like Owen County, would be a guerrilla rendezvous or refuge throughout the war. Well, to the north, the northern part of present-day Elliott County, and then Carter County. Carter County was a red-hot Union county. So here they are, bordering each other, but the political views were, or the loyalties, I should say,
Mhm.
North-South loyalties were just complete polar opposites. And so there was a lot of, just as in Owen County and Henry County after the Civil War, I think it was a lot of Klan activities
Mhm.
during Reconstruction in those former guerrilla refuge counties. And in northeastern Kentucky, uh, Elliott County became a nest of outlaws well into the 1880s. And it was largely because um, people learned that a band of heavily armed men, 6 or 12, could ride roughshod over an entire region or county as long as enough people shared their uh, politics during the Civil War,
Mhm.
and as long as the terrain was sort of isolated and rugged. So,
Wow.
again, the war ends in 1865, but turmoil would continue for decades after the conflict.
Yeah. Yeah. How divided, I know the answer to this question anyway, but politically, when you look at the legislators of Kentucky who are there in Frankfurt, for most of the part, I guess, uh, they're not really seeing eye to eye either. Um, how does that affect what's going on in Frankfurt?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about Kentucky and the Civil War, and you'll see this reflected in the General Assembly, and of course in each and every county and city, um, Kentuckians who supported the Union did so because they felt that the Union was the best bulwark to defend slavery. So I read, I believe it was in the Louisville Daily Journal, which was a staunch, nationally known Union newspaper, that if Kentucky secedes, Canada will be just across the Ohio River. And so by that, they, of course, again, Canada was a refuge for fugitive slaves for
Mhm.
over a generation before the Civil War. And so that was the point that Kentucky Unionists were making. Well, then our enslaved people can just step across the Ohio River, and the federal government is under no obligation to return them. However, if we stay in the Union, there's the fugitive slave law. And there are also the property rights guaranteed by the Constitution. So, that you'd have a Union majority in the state legislature during the crucial late summer and fall months of 1861, at which time the state abandoned neutrality and decided to fight for the old flag. But it was conditional unionism, so to speak. Conditional loyalty to the Union. And one of the interesting things about the Confederate occupation of Frankfurt, there was a meeting during the Confederate occupation protesting Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And it was attended by both Frankfurt's Southern rights pro-Confederate men and Union moderates. So they were in a total agreement that the Emancipation Proclamation was completely unwarranted, and for Union men, it was a slap in the face and a betrayal, because they felt they were fighting to preserve the old flag, but they were also fighting to preserve the America of Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay, with slavery, left preserved.
What question I had about that, you're talking about public sentiment and how people tried to mesh their personal opinions with what was happening around them. You've got a whole chapter in your book, which not a lot of people talk about what it was like inside occupied Frankfurt. And
Yes.
in Mercer County, I know, for example, when John Morgan's men rode through, a picnic was held, and so we think, well, it's very pro-Confederate. There are a lot of supporters, but the next year they raised a whole Union regiment. The 19th Regiment was raised in Mercer County. It was very
Yeah.
pro-Union. And a lot of people, I think, certainly had convictions, but a lot of people were also doing what was convenient at the time. Did you see a lot of that in Frankfurt in terms of just having to deal with the occupation?
Yeah, there are several instances all through the war. Many Southern rights people or pro-Confederate people remained in the city. Some went into exile, particularly after the Perryville campaign in 1862, when the Confederate Army left the state. Judge Thomas B. Monroe is a distinguished jurist who lived in Frankfurt. And of course, Berry Hill was the site of his mansion overlooking the city. He ended up being a refugee, but others, other good friends continued to interact with each other. While there are other instances, I was just reminded of a letter in which a local Union man complained that some young women that belonged to pro-Confederate families, anytime there was a big Confederate victory, they would dress up in their finest clothes and parade up and down through downtown Frankfurt. And they made a point that when they went by the Mansion House, there was a big United States flag hanging over the entrance. They would step into the street and go around it, so as not to have to walk under the flag. So it was a sign of disrespect. But I know that doesn't entirely answer your question, but the one thing I did focus on was the home front. And Union women, they had charitable events to raise money, to buy socks and other items to send to their loved ones that were in the Union Army. Excuse me. And of course, the pro-Confederate element, women worked with Confederate agents in sort of an underground railroad of letters. So letters from their family members that were fighting before Atlanta in Georgia in 1864, or on the eve of Shiloh, and they're in northern Mississippi, anywhere in the South, really, would be sent back to Kentucky and then delivered secretly to certain women in the capital. And then they would go about in their buggy and then deliver letters to their family members. But yeah, I tried to focus on all aspects of the community, and that would of course include enslaved people and free persons of color. And again, there were a lot of instances of fugitive slaves during the war, local enslaved people taking refuge in Union camps. There was a clash between Union soldiers and local constables and civilians on the street in front of the old Capitol because when the regiment was marching through, uh, several local enslaved men asked to take refuge, and they let them into their ranks. And so when the constables came with the owners to reclaim their human property, why the Union soldiers lowered their bayonets and wouldn't let them take them back. So, and then of course, after 1864, a lot of Franklin County free and enslaved men of color would serve in the Union Army. And I was really intrigued by the fact that the African American GAR post, the Union Veterans Organization, was probably the most active in the city. And in 1888, they were the only GAR post that held a parade on what was then known as Decoration Day, what we call Memorial Day, and involved the decoration of the war dead's graves in the cemetery. And so I was really intrigued by that. So they were very active, and of course they held a huge picnic after the black community in Frankfurt after the news of Lee's surrender in 1865. So I tried my best to cover every element in the city, both on the home front and then following local men in their wartime experiences throughout the South.
Absolutely.
What was the population? I know you mentioned about 3,000 was the population. What was the percentage of, enslaved,
I would say
free, and
it
so
would be
forth?
close
Or
to almost close to a third of that. And
oh,
yeah,
wow.
so again, the uh, the white population in Frankfurt is reduced even further if you enumerate the enslaved people. So that that's another interesting aspect. But there were several colorful incidents that took place. One of my favorite occurred toward the end of the war, and a young enslaved woman who happened to be owned by the Harlan family, John Marshall Harlan's mother, went to a Union recruiting officer and said, I hear the war's over. Am I free? And he said, no, no. He says, you are not free. You're still held in bondage lawfully. And so the only way that you could ever become free at this point is if you marry a quote colored soldier. Well, at that time there was a file of African American recruits standing across the street. So she just walked across the street, went up and down the line, and said, "You." And so she picked out a man, and they were married by the regimental chaplain, and so she became free. So I thought that was a
Oh,
really humorous, but also telling incident in the
mhm.
conflict.
Absolutely.
Wow. That is quite interesting. That might be another, more information on that would be good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Um,
And again, I see this book as just laying the foundations, and I
mhm,
hope that scholars in the future will continue to find fresh material that'll flesh out the details even more thoroughly.
mhm.
I combed the governor's papers. I combed Franklin County lawsuits, both civil and criminal. And as I shared earlier, newspapers in the city and around Kentucky, and as many diaries, letters, and manuscripts as I could find. So, but
Yeah.
again, it's as David would tell you, repositories like UK Special Collections, the Filson Historical Society, the State Archives are constantly acquiring new materials out there. So hopefully there'll be some fresh sources that'll come down the line in the years ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, how long? I mean, did you say 6 years?
Yes,
It took you
6 years.
about 6 years to
Yes.
write it. Yeah. I mean, how many hours do you think?
Oh, I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you. I wasn't about to produce a, coffee table book or a vanity
Mhm.
book. Uh, One of my pet peeves, and particularly where Kentucky history is concerned, is that, there's so much written in sort of broad general terms, and I think it would be a real contribution, for historians to do, local histories and county histories and regional histories that someone could use to, as building blocks to, to paint a broader picture like Kentucky during the Civil War,
Mhm.
just to cite one
Mhm.
historical epic. But
Mhm.
yeah, I was going to make sure that I searched it or researched it as thoroughly as I possibly could.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's good when you mentioned that about the local history and so forth, and that sometimes, you paint this big brush picture of Kentucky and this and that, and those incidents like you brought up. Owen County is staunch Confederate.
Yeah,
And then you turn around and say, well, these areas were very very much Union. Quick picture: Eastern Kentucky, all Union. Western Kentucky, all Confederate.
yeah,
Bluegrass, mostly Union, a little bit of Confederate below, say, Pulaski County or something like that. You get those things, and it goes even deeper than that when you start digging around and looking.
yeah, and virtually every historical event and personage um, related to Kentucky and the nation, it's always going to be a lot more complex than most people are willing to understand,
Mhm.
especially in these times when, I was watching a CNN report, talking a bit about just how politicized our universities have become. And the history has become so politicized and controversial. And so, you know, I I tune out everything that's happening in 2023, and I try to understand the past through their eyes and their value systems and their belief systems, and that in order to paint it as accurate uh, description of the people and the times as possible.
Mhm. Well, that sounds like a good way to do it.
But you mentioned earlier about it, the capture of Frankfurt being a farce, and my question is, was it always doomed to be that? Were the Confederates convinced that Buell would withdraw across the river? I know people in Cincinnati were beginning to get nervous and places like that. Was there ever a chance in the mind of the Confederacy at success, or did they realize this was going to be a temporary seizure for the political value?
That's again a heavily discussed subject, and as to whether or not the campaign could have succeeded. I know for Kentuckians at that time, the Confederate Officer Corps, generals like Humphrey Marshall and John C. Breckinridge and other high-ranking Kentuckians, they believed that the state could have been, to use their language, redeemed, and that it was Braxton Bragg, the primary Confederate commander. It was his his fault that the Union forces weren't driven out. But I think in terms of logistics and other factors uh, that you could best describe as the fog of war, it may have been a bridge too far. And I think what probably hurt um, the Confederate cause in 1862 more than anything else was that the forces of Braxton Bragg, General Kirby Smith, and General Humphrey Marshall never concentrated, never united into a single force. And, that may have been due to, personality uh, conflicts, because I believe that Smith saw himself as the true liberator of Kentucky, after the colossal defeat at Richmond and his occupation of Lexington and Frankfort. But it had those forces concentrated, the Battle of Perryville might have ended very differently.
Mhm. Yeah, it kind of makes me think too. Yeah, I mean, there may be documentation saying otherwise, or not, that that they may have, it might have been more of a publicity stunt. Could that have been the case? Hey, let's go take this
Well,
capital real
that's
quick.
an interesting point. I think Bragg was deeply hoping that Kentuckians would rise up, but and of course, this is my take. What Bragg didn't understand is that the Confederacy had failed to maintain a presence in Kentucky early on. So, with the collapse of the defensive lines around Bowling Green in late 1861, the defeat at the Battle of Mill Springs in early 1862, the defeat of Humphrey Marshall in the Big Sandy Valley in January of 1862. Almost after every one of these particular with retreats or defeats, Kentucky volunteers would desert. And so when Humphrey Marshall retreated from the Big Sandy Valley into southwestern Virginia and went into winter quarters, scores of his Kentucky troops deserted. And so you see the same thing happen when Bragg and Smith and Marshall retreat from the state in the fall of 1862. Those Kentuckians who had enlisted, many of them deserted. Like an entire battalion-sized unit, to cite Humphrey Marshall's command as an example, just simply disappeared. And one of his infantry regiments, a Kentucky regiment, demanded to be mustered out, before they left the state. So I think Kentuckians were waiting to see if Bragg and Smith could actually defeat Buell, the Union commander, and actually hold the state before they would take up arms. And of course, Bragg was very disgusted because the rate of enlistments wasn't as high as he expected. So he began to think he was on a fool's errand, as I understand it, and decided it was just best to withdraw. It was more important for his command to take Kentucky hogs and beef, mules and horses back into Tennessee than volunteers. So that became his main goal when he decided to retreat.
Well, you got to have your hogs and horses, especially they come from Kentucky. So, anything else you want to cover? You want to talk about some of your other stuff?
Well, one last thing as far as Frankfurt is concerned,
Okay.
what intrigued me as I was writing the book was just how long the war lasted for a lot of Franklin County Union soldiers. Members of the 22nd Kentucky Infantry, which had companies recruited in Franklin County and Frankfurt, were merged into the 7th Kentucky Veteran Infantry. And they were stationed in Louisiana when the war ended, and they remained on active duty until March of 1866. And of course, the last Union soldier did not leave Frankfurt until September 20th of 1865. So that's something else to note. But the African American soldiers from Kentucky, of course, but Franklin and Franklin County, they weren't mustered out until 1867. So they were serving in Texas along the border with Mexico, because again, the United States government feared that the French takeover in Mexico would threaten the southern border of the United States. So yeah, that was one thing that really intrigued me. Again, that Appomattox was not quite the end of the struggle. But as far as like some of the other projects, I've always been interested in guerrilla warfare in Kentucky, and particularly in the mountains. Another project I've got on the burner relates to the Harp brothers, who were notorious
Oh, yeah.
frontier era outlaws. And
Mhm.
I've done a lot of research on those two unkind men, and hope to do a book length study on them at some point in the future, because I found a lot of fresh material on those gentlemen. And I, when I was a member of the Kentucky Humanities Council Speakers Bureau for a number of years, I traveled the states, giving talks on famous Kentucky duels. Uh,
Mhm.
Jesse James in Kentucky, which was
Mhm.
really a lot of fun because every county in Kentucky that you go to, um, Jesse James would hide there, or Jesse James would had some gold that was hidden there.
I was
And
reading that months ago.
Jesse James, after the such and such bank robbery, stayed at my great grandmother's or grandfather's house. Of course, again, my family is from northeastern Kentucky, and the Missouri Outlaws actually did rob the Huntington, West Virginia bank in September of 1875, and it's believed to have been Frank James, Cole Younger, and a couple of lesser known members of the James Younger gang, and they fled through eastern Kentucky and
Uh-huh.
were pursued heavily, including a heavily armed posse from Carter County, and they engaged in gun
Mhm.
battles all the way down to Rockcastle County and around Beattyville and so forth.
Mhm.
And so my father, of course, his mother's maiden name was James, and my father was convinced that we were related to Frank and Jesse James, which we're not. But he told me that Jesse James stayed with his uh, great great grandfather James near Olive Hill in Carter County after the Huntington, West Virginia bank robbery. But when I began to do research on the Huntington robbery, again, I found out that Jesse, who wasn't really in that robbery at all, he was in Nashville. He stayed with everybody's grandpa.
Somehow
Just
he did it.
ruined one of my favorite stories from my dad. So by all means, I'd love to work with you gentlemen in the future,
Mhm.
and any type of topics from the pioneer era
Mhm.
to World War One. I've done a lot of research on feud violence. I
Mhm.
participated in a History Channel presentation on the Hatfield McCoy feud several years ago. So
Mhm.
anything to do with Kentucky's violent past, why I've
You're
yeah
ready to dig in.
been pursuing that for a number of years now.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and you bring up, when you start throwing out topics, all the bells start going off. I read where Henry Skaggs supposedly went looking for the
Oh
harpies.
yes,
I
yes.
think we talked about that in a previous podcast. And then talk about Jesse James. Well, here in Lincoln County, Jesse James robbed a bank in Houstonville, and
Mhm.
big getaway. From what I hear, I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they definitely, I mean, there's a lot of truth to the legend. They had, friends in Nelson County, so Nelson County was a refuge for the, James and Youngers, and also, in Logan County. Their uncle lived in Logan
Mhm.
County, and so they would stay with, their uncle, and the old house still
Yeah.
stands,
Yeah.
near
Oh,
Russellville. Of course,
wow.
they robbed the Russellville Bank, they robbed the Columbia, Kentucky Bank, later, uh, in the 1880s, Jesse robbed a stagecoach at Mammoth Cave. So again, they were active on the outlaw trail in Kentucky as much as Missouri and Texas and elsewhere.
Mhm. Ev Well, every county in Kentucky has to claim something about Daniel Boone,
Yep,
something about Abraham Lincoln, and something about Jesse
yep,
James. So
yeah. He's morphed into probably one of the most towering folk lore figures.
Mhm.
The folklore Jesse James.
Mhm.
In American history and Kentucky history. because
Yeah.
I always had a full house anytime I gave that talk on Jesse James of Kentucky.
Yeah, yeah. David, you got anything else?
I think that covers it well. It's a great book. I've enjoyed it.
Well,
Yeah.
I appreciate
Yeah,
it very
well,
much. Like I said, it's been, wow, it came out in 2014, so I'm going to have to, step up my game here a little bit and try to get something else out there. Uh, I love to research, but, sometimes the writing is like, pulling your own teeth. So, hopefully I'll have, some other books we can talk about in the not too distant future.
Yeah. Well, that sounds good, Mr. Pritchard. Thank you a bunch for coming on. Where can people get your book? Where's the easiest place for
Poor
them to get it?
Richard's Bookstore in, downtown Frankfurt, and of course through Amazon.
Mhm.
So it'll
Okay.
be available to order online.
All
There it
right.
is for anyone who's looking to pick it up.
There we go. Well, we thank you a bunch for coming back on, and the invitation's out there, and we can definitely talk some more Kentucky history topics. You got a wealth of knowledge that we'd love to have you on again, and just talk about the Kentucky history. That's what the podcast is about. So, thanks again for coming
My
on.
pleasure. You gentlemen have a good evening, and I hope to work with you again in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank everybody for listening, and we'll see you next
Take
time.
care. Have a good evening.
Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.